Okay. Welcome, Yvonne Barnes-Holmes. If I'm guessing people will be here because they've searched probably your name on YouTube and not mine, and they already probably know what RFT, relational frame theory is, what ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy is, and maybe even what PBBT, process-based behavior therapy is. If you don't know what those things are, I've just defined them, and I'd suggest go and do some Googling before you watch this, because we will probably get a bit technical and we won't define things too heavily. And if you're looking for something that's nice and technical, and where we get into the juicy bits, then you're in the right place. So thanks for joining me, Yvonne.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start with an RFT question, but a little bit more detailed. So RFT, I guess it has a particular view of the cause of human suffering and the best place to intervene on that suffering. And I wonder if you could just talk about that for a bit to start with.
Okay, so as a theory of language, RFT doesn't specify the cause and it isn't interested in intervening because it's a basic scientific theory. It has implications for those things. We can abstract from RFT and its home inside behavior analysis and inside functional contextualism. We can abstract from those sort of cornerstones what RFT would have implications in terms of. But as a scientific theory, it's interested in understanding human complexity in terms of human language and human cognition as the same thing. So it's seeking an explanation of complex human behavior. And as part of that explanation, it says that this is complexity. The complexity that defines humans is this. And in the behavioral world, that comes from context and evolution, including biology and other things. So it's RFT's home inside behavior analysis that sort of talks about where it comes from. But RFT itself is just interested in explaining complexity in a behavioral functional way. And that's all it's trying to do. Of course, RFT is a behavioral theory of language, so it's interested in prediction and influence. So it's interested in predicting, does it explain causality in the way it thinks? And if you use that prediction, can you then influence causality? And of course, that influence in causality is what it does in experiments. And then we extrapolate from that to influence behavior and emotions of therapy. So it's the same influence, but we're influencing a different dynamical context where you've not got control over the variables. Whereas RFT's direct influence as a scientific theory is laboratory context. So we can stretch it, but that's not its intention. Just to be clear, it just wants to be a theory. It is a theory, and it's best just being a theory.
Yeah, that's a nice distinction. So I'm thinking about like theories in physics or other sciences, and it's like they don't tell you what to do. They're just kind of telling you how things work.
Exactly, and it wants to do that. Except that it's got prediction and influence inside its behavioral home. So it isn't just prediction only. Influence is 50% of it, but it exerts that influence in an experimental context, as you'd expect a scientific theory to do.
So then if we kind of step from that into PBBT, what is if I asked a similar question, like what's the theory of or the places in suffering that we're trying to intervene within the PBBT work? What would you say?
If you follow through that logic, the RFT logic that complexity is everything, and language and cognition are the definition of complexity. So language and cognition are everything. And you take that into PBBT, then for PBBT, the argument, the basis then would be, well, language and cognition are the problem, but in the sense that they're just how development works. not the problem in a pathological or causal sense. That's just development doing what development does. So our job is to look at the way development occurs to explain why this developmental trajectory is currently problematic for the client, and then to intervene in the relating and its functions that are the problematic bits, if you know what I mean, in a very sort of click, scalpel, scientific, precise like way. We find the pieces of meaning, but they're not pieces, they're like the self. We find the segments of meaning, and its functions that are basically the pieces of development that are doing damage. And we tweak them, we basically deconstruct them, and we really weaken them, and we put alternatives in their place.
So so the point of intervention is kind of the sense of self itself.
Exactly, as relating and its functions based on updated RFT. If you define the sense of self in that RFT way, which is what we do, then we go in for the sense of self, but we pull it apart into pieces. Now, we don't deal with it as one big thing as some other regimes do.
So, yeah, so in terms of the pieces, I want to come back to that. I just wonder, because this came out of, my understanding is it came out of the RFT updates, which came out of yours and Dermot's and Chiara's and lots of other people's efforts to translate ACT into, or make a translation between ACT and RFT.
Totally correct.
What did you find in that experimental work that led you to say, we need something new here?
Okay, so we got the grant. My husband got the grant to go to Belgium. Sort of the Belgium Science Foundation gave us the grant to do that translation between basic theory and experimental work and procedures to applications. And the application we were most interested in was ACT. Now, that we went in 2015, but of course, by the time 2015 came, we had already done a lot of experimental and a lot of analog work, like creating little mini interventions on ACT interventions. So we really had been doing that. I mean, we'd done about 10 PhDs between the two of us. And you are talking tens, maybe over 100 experiments at that stage on these analog pieces and on this sort of proof of principle type stuff that you do. What is diffusion really? Does it involve the self? What does values mean? Does values clarification exercises help? Is there a relationship between diffusion and avoidance? So by the time 2015 came, we were already pretty glum about the ability to wrestle ACT pieces to the experimental floor. We had tried, in all honesty, in around 10 PhDs, certainly I'd done 5 PhDs on this, and it doesn't matter whether it was mindfulness or whether it was values or whether it was diffusion or whether it was contact present, whatever it was, we couldn't wrestle it. We could not translate it. We were struggling with procedures to do that, but even with the best procedures we had at the time, which was the early days of the IRAP, we still could not engineer back those concepts into experimental outcomes and then manipulate them in any way that gave us any sense of control. So when we got the grant, we realized, well, we can't translate ACT. This won't go. But so what else do we do? And we were at a real impasse. We knew we had a good procedure with the IRAP to be, it wasn't perfect, but it was better than what we'd had before. But we weren't really sure what we were going to do with it. The other thing we had at the time was that we were starting to collect data that the previous version of RFT could not explain. And it seems very, very abstract, those pieces of data. And in one sense, they don't matter. But they matter crucially because if your theory cannot explain its own data, there's a problem with your theory. So we went to Ghent to open up that procedure and open up its data. Was it replicable? Was there something the theory couldn't explain? And as we unfolded that, we unfolded the answer to the ACT problem, if you know what I mean, along the way. So we went with the two problems And the two problems just started to roll together. So the PBBT solution evolved sort of very organically as the hard to explain data on the IRAP thing evolved, and they just, as one rolled, then the other just picked up momentum. But we knew the problem before we went.
And you said the solution to the ACT problem, and is that the fact that you couldn't translate it across to the...
Exactly, we couldn't, and I mean, it wasn't just because ACT was evolving, and in our sense, because we'd argued for a number of years before that ACT had lost its behavioral grip. I mean, we weren't the only ones arguing that. But the truth is, we tried to sort of bring it back, tried to sort of wrestle it back into the behavioral landscape experimentally. And it simply couldn't be done. So it wasn't just the evolution of ACT that was the problem, it was the fundamental concepts in ACT, believe it or not, that we were actually more concerned about at that stage, because we couldn't wrestle them either.
I guess in one sense that seems really healthy when a theory or a practice over time becomes updated or outdated, and on the other hand, there's a lot of investment in the status quo that's not gonna shift into that easily. One of the, I guess my entry into ACT was through the Hexaflex, which I did some training in very long ago, having done a lot of meditation myself and been interested in Buddhism and Zen, and seeing, oh yeah, this is really cool to have a psychological theory that's kind of talking almost a little bit of Buddhist language. But yeah, over time I see some of those Hexaflex concepts almost feel a bit mechanistic or mentalistic, even, of like, as a therapist, I start to almost prescribe mindfulness to the client who has a present moment sort of disorder or deficit, and it can start to feel a bit medicalized or something, but just in flowery language. I'm just wondering, I'm not sure if you want to even talk about this, but with that move towards like the Hexaflex and middle level terms, what did you see sort of happening in that area that you thought was problematic, and what do you think are the ongoing problems with that way of conceptualizing?
There isn't a sort of a hardcore behavior analyst on the planet like me who's comfortable with middle-level terms. We just never were comfortable. We're never going to be. You have to use them in clinical work to some extent, but if you have to use them, you only should have like a one-notch translation. Like they should reticulate really, really closely, like really closely. Once middle-level terms start taking on a life of their own, then it's not behavior analysis, it's not functional anymore for me. So like all behavior analysts, I'm very wary of them. But like all therapists, there's a place for them, but they have to be handled really, really, really brutally and really carefully. We never objected to concepts like middle-level terms from the beginning. We objected to the fact that they stopped saying they were middle-level terms. They stopped acknowledging they were middle level. And when we couldn't get data that translated them, they wouldn't listen. The regime didn't want to listen. Say, no, I can write on the listserv my homemade interpretation of diffusion. And I mean, I'm sorry, but as a scientist and practice, just isn't good enough. I just wasn't raised that way in my professional life. So I just can't accept that half-baked, armchair theorizing. So I didn't have a problem per se with middle-level terms. I had a problem with losing control over them. And I had a problem with them not admitting they were middle level. And then I had a problem with not reining them back in and not having an open dialogue about this has become middle level term city and you're still calling it behavioral. And I just cannot do it. I just can't let that happen. It's not correct. It's not fair. And I just don't think it's particularly healthy for the audience, because audiences are new. They don't know the difference. So they're new to this. And so I think they're being deceived in many ways. And again, I'm just not really comfortable with that. So I'm not a great fan of middle level terms naturally, but they have their uses. And the Hexaflex was originally set up as a training tool. It wasn't set up as something you tell clients. So I hear when you talk there about, using that language in your direct dialogue with clients, and that's not what it was designed for at all.
Mm.
That's your clinical analysis. What you say to your clients is a different thing. They should be connected, but so, and that's just a really good example of how middle-level terms they just run the show after a while. And
Mm.
you can let them run the show if you want, but you don't get to call it behavior therapy. I'm just really black and white about that.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think PBBT does really well is saying, um, just highlighting the distinction between events and the description of events, and saying, we want to get as close as we can, or as technical as we can, or as precise as we can about what's happening here, but we're still not, what we're describing is different than the description itself. And I think as you're saying that we can use any words we want in different contexts, but we also need to have a distinction between everyday language and the technical language of a natural science.
Absolutely. I say, I talk to my clients about head versus heart.
Mm.
No, I just, I do whatever my intervention tells me to do, but I do it in a way it's got the right padding, it's got the right pace, acknowledges someone's spirituality if they have it. It acknowledges someone's race and gender if that's really important to them. I mean, I have to tweak and adjust and roll my dialogue with the client. I have to stay as close to my intervention track, but I have to speak to the human being that I see in front of me, and I have to be my own human being. So, gosh, I mean, we roll with it in the funniest sort of ways, but my job is to go in there, toe the line with my plan and my intervention, but make sure that I've always got eyes on the human being in front of me and the system. But we do not go in there with our clinical analysis. I just do not. I mean, maybe occasionally someone will ask me to explain and I'll do it. But I think they're two different dialogues, not because clients are stupid and they can't do it, but because that's not the way you help someone.
Mm.
That just looks like a lesson. That looks like school. And in my experience, therapy doesn't work really well like that.
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't want to go to the doctor to learn about medicine. I'll just,
Exactly. You want a prescription, you want a
yeah.
listening ear, and you want to know what's wrong.
Yeah,
Exactly.
exactly, exactly. So the updated RFT, let's jump over to that. So one of the things I found really interesting was I read the paper from frames to fields, and moving to a more field orientation. I'm a big fan of Cantor and interbehaviorism as well, as a kind of way to think about, just a way to think about things. What was it in that experimental work, or just in the journey? I've heard Dermot talk about this a little bit, but that sort of shifted the perspective from that starting point of all these different frames into this kind of more field theory of and this more maybe like it sort of seems more closer to, or more aligned with monism in its description of what's happening. Maybe. Yeah,
Okay.
what did you see that kind of shifted the perspective?
Okay. We were never not aligned with monism, never ever for a second. We were always in bed with monism, totally and absolutely. We just don't always see it. Okay. The the field thing, I think, was always in the background for us. And I think RFT had lost its sense of that a little bit. It got I think, very topographical when people were naming frames. We were never happy with that. But we knew that was inevitable because we weren't progressed enough in the work to really get, how do functions transform really? Because we always talked about the transformations of function. We knew for a long time that was a little bit click, 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 it was a little bit mechanistic looking, though we didn't really think about it that way. But we knew that we weren't there on the explanation. Remember, RFT is only 30, 40 odd years of age, so it's still sort of young. So we knew where there were gaps, but when there's gaps in a scientific field, you don't go around telling people where the gaps are, and you don't, if people go, there's a gap here, you don't go, yeah, there is, I don't have the answer. So to be honest, you do a bit of fudging. If you look in the first RFT book, there's a fair bit of fudging went on. We knew what we couldn't answer, but you just answer what you answer, and you just go out about doing your work, thinking, oh, the big piece we need to do is this piece. So we knew there was a massive piece of work needed done on the transfer. What was the transformation of stimulus functions? And in Ghent, we really set about doing that work. And, you know, Kieran, I often tell the story about the day that we realized that we saw some data on separating functions out, like the dominance of functions over relating, or the dominance of relating over functions. And then we started to see that there's a very dynamical relationship. It's not like the functions just hop over when they relate, because that's sort of the way we sort of demonstrated before, but we knew it wasn't a great explanation. And in truth, it was people like Colin Hart's work and Martin Finn's work, especially Martin's, which is very bean county, very, very abstract, but you can see the effects really, really clearly. And that sort of relationship, making one dominant over the other, making functions dominate relating, or relating dominate functions in a really, really clean experimental context. We knew the day that we all knew the day, the first lab meeting when we saw that data, we all knew it was a game changer. We knew something was coming around the corner, and Dermot had already, because he's usually ahead of the game, he'd already started to create models like the DARE model, and you know, the describe effects, like he called the Stuti effect and the Duty effect, which is just an IRAP thing. But he was already thinking of the solution, like the model question, and how that model would create an answer. And then he just followed his nose with the experimental work, just one experiment after the other after the other. And then the model started to make predictions that the experiments were starting to sort of uphold. And then this dynamical relationship between playing with relating versus functions, it just started to become really clear. And then the answer to that was the row unit. He basically said the only way to explain this data is to put these things together as a unit. And he'd been studying units in physics, and for a couple of years before, our house was full of physics books and what does a physics unit look like. And I knew they were connected, but I didn't know how. So I knew that we knew that day that the relationship between relating and functions, and this old question about the transformation of functions, we knew that was the answer that day. And Kira and I knew, we knew that day it was going to have massive implications for therapy, whatever that was going to be. And then we just all went about unpacking it experimentally, unpacking it conceptually, thinking about it philosophically, and Kira and I unpacked it therapeutically, and we ended up with PBBT.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's
That
jump
was a cool
into
day.
that sounds amazing. And that must have been after you talked about the angst of just like, this translation's not going to work. And yeah, it must have been,
Depressing was
must have,
really, it was very just depressing. You spent years loving ACT and working on it and thinking about it, and you just think, okay, you can make a certain amount of excuses. There's a certain amount of data you can say, well, there's a reason for that and there's a reason for that. But eventually you have to just call it a day and just say, well, this is not right. There's something not right here.
Mm.
And it's a difficult day to do that, but it's just the game we're in.
Mm. I think it's good to draw that distinction, because I found you through ACT, and probably people watching will be lots of ACT people, and yeah, I'm at the point of kind of drawing that line of getting that no, PBBT is something different that has some similar sounding things, but it's completely different kind of
But remember, I
therapy.
was there too once, you
Yeah.
know, I think people forget that I came through that ACT road too. So it means a great deal to me. But like you said, I know when to call it a day. I know when something doesn't do what I need it to do, and I know when things need to be explained. So it's just behavioral in the way I think. But I came through that gate as well.
Mm. Well, it sounds like a good script for a movie that would only appeal to like therapy
If
nerds
only it was
like
that
me.
exciting. It wouldn't be a very good movie.
Dermot just looking at the physics books, just doing a Russell Crowe in
That's
Beautiful
does.
Beautiful
Yeah.
Mind. So let's talk about the row. You mentioned that. So if people haven't kind of come across that, that's in the more Fields and Frames paper, and if you search row ROE RFT, you'll find a heap of stuff, and I'll link to your website as well in the description so people can do their own digging.
We have a paper on the record, sorry, just to interrupt. We have a paper,
Mm.
the first written paper on PBBT is coming out in the psychological record soon. And it has the whole front end has got a description of the row in it as well. But we sort of put little clinical examples and then we connect it to PBBT. So I think for people who are, clinically interested and who really struggle to read basic papers because they're just not interesting to them, then we tried to make sure that that paper keeps the two together. So if the more Field and Frame paper is just too much for you, it's just too boring or whatever, too dry, then the row is described in the new paper. So I think that just might be more interesting for clinicians in that context.
Okay. And when's that coming out? Do you know?
It's just gone in for a second review, which I hopefully will be short. So the journal tells me it's a good chance it'll be out by summer.
Okay.
Be available by summer, and we'll
Cool.
get some version of that up on our website as soon as we can. Obviously allowing for copyright or whatever. So we'll get that out to our PBBT interested folks. And it's great to have something out. That's the thing.
Awesome. So talk us through the row, and then we might sort of, I'll ask you some more.
The row is basically the unit for us, the unit of human complexity. It's what make people people. And I think in a way, we're just embodied rows. We're just a bunch of row units that are all linked together, if you know what I mean. The row unit contains these three interlocking parts. We sort of depict it like a little triangle, an equilateral triangle, and we put the sort of relating or the meaning bit at the top, and we put the functions, the orienting and evoking at the bottom. But it's just like constantly moving a Rubik's Cube. It's just in constant oscillation. Relating is changing, its functions are changing, it's changing the relating. So it's this constantly dynamical system where one tweak in one end potentially has an impact on the other. So it's just, these units they're as big or as small as you want them to be. They're like relational networks. In a way, they can be big and fat, or they can be small and thin. But for us, self is like a series of row units about the self. And it's the dynamical sort of flow-like, feel-like nature of those units constantly moving and shaking with each other, constantly oscillating as you go about your sort of direct and indirect verbal world, that just is the definition of self at that time. So you take all of history and you take the ongoing oscillations in the field, and that's just what self is. It's just interlocking row units. And I think the thing about the row unit that always fascinates me is that it can explain so much, and you don't need anything else. You don't need, in a way, you don't need a three-term contingency. Well, one, because these aren't directly learned, and two, because the row covers just about everything, which is why PBBT is totally built on rows, because if you see rows, you see human beings. You don't need anything else. And that's, I think, the wonder of the row, so small but so mighty.
Mm.
Because it captures the dynamical nature of meaning and its functions, and that it captures it all in one unit. And that, for me, that's just genius.
So would it be fair to say, like, we're conceptualizing our verbal system as like this kind of ecosystem of all these different rows, and then some of them, like these self rows, and maybe some of the self other rows, just exert they're like the apex predator. They're like the apex predators in these systems, and if we tweak their numbers or their behaviors or their interactions, then it's like the whole ecosystem changes.
Exactly, it tweaks. And also, yeah, it's exactly like that. And we sort of think about these units as the ones that have the most functionality, the ones that make you do the most. And you're right. I mean, the predator, I think metaphor is lovely for that. They're the ones that are calling the shots.
Yeah. And if you take
Good
them
or
out,
bad.
if you could, you know, like in ecosystems, if you take out an apex predator, it's like everything changes. We can't take out a roe,
Everything changed.
but
Exactly.
if you tweak it,
But remember, there's a reason they became the apex predator in the first place, and we're very evolutionarily and field sensitive. So, you know, they're there for survival, they're there for management, they're there for coping. You know, they're not there for good reasons necessarily, but they've got a purpose. They've got a so you've got to understand why they're there if you're going to deconstruct them. It's not just a question of cutting off that limb.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And I like the term, the verbal system. I think that's a nice way of thinking about what are we working with, what's influencing us, and what's kind of out there interacting with the world, because we tend to think I'm out there interacting with the world, but that I is my verbal system kind of.
The world's interacting the verbal system's playing you. It's just a really useful way to see yourself as passive and not active. I know you feel active and I want you to be as active as possible, but the fact is that we're just largely passive to the verbal system history leans us towards. So I wish that wasn't the case, but it is.
Yeah, well, sometimes I think having something that's just driving that's evolutionarily adapted might be better than me just being in charge. But the me, yeah, anyway, we get really meta, but I won't. So the row we've got relating, orienting, and evoking.
Yeah.
Let's start with relating, because I know PBBT sees that as you know, heavily, like that's a really important place to start, and it's not the case in every therapy. So what does that relating piece, what does that actually mean in terms of that verbal system?
So it's self-meaning. It's the clinician's label for self-meaning. So we identify, or try to as accurately as possible, identify key pieces of self-meaning at 3 time samples. You know, childhood, the layer of childhood, which we sort of now call the essence layer, and the layer, sort of middle layer, which we now call the character layer, that sort of seems to form or define your adolescence and early childhood. And then there's what we call the sort of manifest or visible or top layer, seems to define, you know, who you are, or where the self-meaning is at in your sort of current, usually adult life. So it's like we created this 3-layer structure. One, to be sensitive to the fact that meaning develops. It doesn't fall out of the sky, and it develops in a very evocative way. So early development, middle development, later development, it sort of rolls in that sort of way. So these 3 time samples represent essentially what your childhood told you should mean, what your adolescence and middle years told you should mean, and what your current years tell you have to feel and you have to mean. So rather than giving it one label and say, oh, you know, I am anxious, or I am broken, or I am invisible, it made sense clinically, and it made sense evolutionarily and for RFT to take time samples across these really pivotal phases in your life, because meaning evolves. What you meant to yourself as a teenager is in there, but it isn't what you mean to yourself now, but it's in there driving the ship now. So we created these 3 time samples, or 3 layers that rolled into each other developmentally, that you as a clinician had to basically give the most accurate label you could to that piece of meaning. So the sort of manifest layer, we might say, I am anxious, or I am afraid, because your identity is through that manifested to that key emotional experience. Because remember, what we're dealing with identity, self-meaning is identity, and it's everything identity encompasses. So, and you know, you become, you know, Mr. Miss they afraid, because you were Mr. Miss they broken, and you were Mr. Miss and they, you know, they invisible, or they unloved, or nothing or worthless or whatever. So they identifying as accurately as you can self-meaning. And PBBT is not everything, but it's a lot, because clients feel known, and their story, and I don't mean their story as an out there, I mean the story of their identity, it gets heard, it gets aired, it gets to be seen. They get to be seen as broken. Not that I'm saying they're broken, but they're seen as a person who believes they're broken. So there are so many benefits, not just accuracy in terms of your clinical work, but for a client, there are so many important benefits that go with someone saying, I'm not saying I believe this, but this is who I really believe you think you are. This is who I really believe you believe about yourself. And so we create these 3 time samples and these 3 labels to match what we see at those time samples and what we know about those time samples. And then we work with those labels, but not label in the traditional sort of, you know, broken biology way, label and just labeling the meaning, just giving the meaning a label.
Mm. So you're essentially saying, without saying, without saying it in a technical sense, but you're saying when you were a child, your verbal system made sense of the world around you by deciding that you were broken or you were invisible, and then it told you what to do to survive, given that you're invisible. And then when you're a teenager, that evolved to this, and now you're presenting as, this
because
is
it tells
happening.
you how to feel. If you're living with I'm invisible, and then it becomes a way to cope with that as I'm good enough, I'm not good enough. It takes no time at all for you to get anxious about that, or depressed about that, or empty or afraid about that. The emotional manifestations, essentially in one way, partly just a consequence of living with the burden of proving your worth through being good enough. You'll end up emotional one way or another because it's such an awful burden.
So if that's like the self-relating or the identity piece at each level, is there like a self-other relating piece at each level that's important, or does that just depend on the client, whether that's obviously we have self-other relating as part of our system, but is that something you would always be looking at each level with a client, or does it depend?
That's one of those great dilemmas we had in PBBT, because you have to make strategic decisions in the developing of a therapy. And in an ideal world, I would want a clinician to be thinking about self-other at every layer. But in practice, they don't really need to. In practice, what you need to do in terms of the minimal but essential work is you need to look at self-other at the beginning, and we call that the proxy phase now in PBBT, because client comes into me and I am a proxy for A and other. I am one of them. So we open up the sort of self-other rows early on in terms of me being a proxy for the world. And then we work on the layers, and then we go back over to what's called then the self-other perspective. That's that self-other row. So you can do good clinical work, and you can really focus on the self-relating if you front and back end it with the self-other stuff. But if you're trying to roll them together, just clinically, it's really hard to keep your focus. And one thing I certainly learned developing PBBT, clinicians have so much going on in the room, and it's so fluid and dynamic. You don't want to give them too much to do, because you just can't keep all those balls in the air at one time. So what we've done in PBBT is we've tried to pace what clinicians are doing at any given time to the minimum we can. So front ending and back ending with self-other, and then sort of typically using the middle work to focus on the layers, seems to be enough. It seems to be enough. So then you can look at things like, are the self-other rows, are they dominating? And then if they are dominating, then you sort of loosen that in the proxy work. You get it out of the way for your layers. And then you only go back and work on it when it's not in your way anymore. But if it's in your way, you'll have to do it. But if you roll them together, it just blows clinicians' heads off. You just can't work like that clinically. And if you've done a lot of clinical work, you just can't keep too many balls in the air at one time. So we don't force you to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. I think the proxy work, I think it's a really, as I said, interested into behaviorism, and I'm really interested in the history of the client coming into the room with them. And I think some therapies, it's almost like you can just know from the way they act, or the functions, kind of what you'll be able to tell what's going on. But I like that, just front ending that recognition that I represent something just by being here, just by being another, just by being whatever my degree is and my setting and all that kind of stuff. And we need to kind of acknowledge that and move it out of the way of our conversations before we have those conversations.
And the truth is, in a simple way, you represent a threat.
Mhm.
You represent someone that makes people feel undermined, feel small. They think you've got your shit together. You know, they don't know you. They just think, oh, he's cool. He knows what he's about. I haven't a clue. I'm broken. So in a simple way, you represent a threat, and that's not a good starting condition for a therapeutic relationship. So our job is to acknowledge that it's threat-like, if you know what I mean, to move that obstacle out of the way so that they don't just constantly feel threatened by you.
Mhm. So we've got these kind of three layers of self-relating, and then we're kind of front-ending and back-ending the self-other. And I know that's dynamical as well, but I wanted to look at, so the evoking part of the row is where a lot of therapies get really excited, and clinicians, because there's things that we can play with on the surface. So can you just talk us through, like, how do you view evoking in PBBT, and kind of, yeah, let's start with that.
I know clinicians get excited with functions because they think that they can play with them, but when you realize how stubbornly embedded they are in meaning and how stubborn is, you're just much less excited, because you realize that, you know, without getting too linear about it, meaning is driving the ship. Functions only make sense because they're driving that ship. So your arms and legs are just told what to do, if you know what I mean. I mean, it's dynamical, but you get my drift here. So you can't see evoking. You have to see evoking as the servant, and you have to see relating as the master, and that really helps. And your job is to work out what the master's making the servant do, and why would that serve the system? Why would the master want that? And what way is the master going to dodge you? What way is the master going to play evoking so that other people don't catch on that you're, you know, insecure, and that you think you're broken, and you think you're evil, and you're invisible, and whatever. So you've really got to keep your eye on the master, and you've really got to realize that evoking is just a servant of that. And again, it pulls me back to this thread in PBBT that's just so important. And the idea that you believe you're active, but you're really passive, and that active passive distinction is massive in PBBT, because, you know, all clients believe that they know what they're doing and they know what's wrong, but they can't help doing it, but they're still doing it. And the PBBT take is absolutely you doing it, but you're not in charge of it, because you're the servant. Your arms and legs are the servant, and self-meaning or relating is the master. So we always deal with functionality as passive. Always, always, always. Okay. That's the sort of key thread on it. The other thing is that what's very different in PBBT in terms of functions, in fact, I think it's completely different. I haven't found this anywhere else, although it's consistent behaviorally 100%, is that we see basically all functions as S pluses, as what we call active responses. They're just the technical label for that is an S plus. It's an approach or repetitive move. It's a move towards a stimulus in a way. And in technical terms, everything you do, everything you feel, every activation of the system is an S plus. And that basically accounts for everything you do, because very little of what you do is an S minus. Because you get up in the morning and you do stuff. You don't S minus all day. You S plus all day. But what the S pluses do, they allow the S minuses to stay alive. because they allow you to maintain the avoidance of the stimuli while you're eating cake, you're not smoking. I mean, it's a simple example, but if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think that was a really radical move in PBBT, which we sort of had to just really be very explicit about from the very beginning. And it's very unlike ACT in that way. ACT's very focused on S minuses, and that has always been a problem for us with ACT. So you can't just, well, one, they're really hard to see. Two, they're really hard to get your hands on. Three, they're really hard to change. So if it's all S minuses, what is it the clients are doing? And the argument, oh, it's all just control is the problem. That's just all really, really generic and didn't really tell me that much. So again, this is all driven by the sort of experimental data and by us going back to sort of talk to very traditional behavioral analysts about, what can we call these clinical behaviors or these things that people do? And the technical term is an S plus. So PBBT now sees many, many more S pluses than it sees S minuses. And your job then is you wrestle with the system and you weaken the system in part by weakening these S pluses. So the relative dominance of S plus over S minus is, I think, almost entirely unique to PBBT.
Could you say that like the S plus was kind of protecting the S minus from
Exactly. That's
exposure?
exactly the way
Yeah,
you
okay.
say it. Yeah,
So
yeah.
it's like if you're doing nothing, that's an S plus that protects you from feeling insecure or
Exactly.
whatever. Yeah. That makes sense because yeah, as I've studied it, I'm like, seeing a lot of S pluses and I'm not sure what the S minus is. So
Exactly.
that's kind of so the S
That's the
minus
point.
might be more like the deeper emotional experience or the pain that they're not that they're being protected from, but it's like two sides of a coin kind of.
Exactly the way we see it. We see that these S pluses create a context that maintains the S minuses. And protective is a great word for it because it keeps it keeps you away from them. It keeps you and me and everybody else away from them. It allows them to live underground, which is why you don't really see S minuses at the sort of top and middle layers. You really start to see them when you get into that sort of core essence layer. S minuses aren't just sitting there waiting to pop out. They're surrounded by these S pluses. And when you start to weaken those S pluses, you really see what exactly is being avoided. What is that feeling that they can't touch? Whereas you just can't get eyes on that. It's you just can't see the wood for the trees.
Mm,
And those metaphors, I think, really were really pivotal in the development of PBT. And I have to say, that's been certainly PBBT's crown and glory. The focus on S pluses has turned out to be really, really effective. It's really done its time and it's really stood the test of time and clients and supervision and trainings and workshops and whatever. It has come out on top every time.
yeah, that's probably my favorite part so far is that shift has been really powerful. And I'm imagining like watching someone move around the house and say they've got some muscular thing going on and so they're moving differently. But if you just look at the movement, it's there to make sure that because it hurts when I reach this way or it hurts when I move naturally and it's like from looking at those movements and then when you say like wash out the S pluses when you help them to drop those and then move naturally, then they're gonna feel, oh, okay, there's a pain in my shoulder I didn't know about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's
Okay.
compensation, isn't it? It's just like compensating.
Mm. And so at that top layer, at that manifest layer, people are coming into therapy. I like S plusing as a verb. I think people are coming into therapy and some more than others, but I see some people coming in and they're just kind of S plusing the shit out of
In a
you
way. Yeah, they are.
to just keep you, yeah, I think keep your hands off is a nice way to phrase it. And I've heard you talk about like finding the kind of dominant S plus or maybe the class of S plus. Can you just talk about what that means at that manifest layer and why
Okay.
you think it's
Just,
important?
yeah, just two things. Just to say that what is unusual for people in PBBT, but this is not unusual in behavioral thinking, but it's not inconsistent with that, is the idea that felt emotions are an S plus. That's why in PBBT we sort of converted the label S plus, because it's really dry and hard to get your head around to what's called an active response. If I feel anxious, it's an active response. It's active, it's in the system, I'm having it right here, right now, it's active. So emotions and memories, and they're all active responses. So that takes a while for people to go, oh, an emotion is an active, emotion is an S plus. Yes, it is. Okay, so that's a bit unusual. It's a PBBT concept, it's not an RFT, it makes clinical sense, but if you think about this as one verbal system, you would predict that these S pluses across these layers would be connected in some way. Because the systems has an agenda, and the agenda is deal with visibility by not paying enough, and then deal with the anxiety that comes with that. So it's a coherent system. So sometimes clinicians, like you said, they get excited with the functions, but what PBBT does is it gets you to see, but how are the functions all related in the same system? The three layers are related to each other, so their functions must be related to each other. So what do all these functions do for the system? Do they give it control? Do they give it the ability to regulate emotions? Do they try to give it control over other people? Do they get it to make the world easier, slow things down, manage things, for example? So we started to ask clinicians to formulate or abstract something called the dominant S plus. But that was really as a way of forcing the clinician to think about the verbal system as a whole system, rather than let it get too bitty, to think about its agenda for this human being. You know, your verbal system says you got to control things because everyone and everything's a threat. So allowing clinicians to think about the dominant S plus forced them to think about the consistency between S pluses and the consistency between layers. And it forced them to think about, as well as working at the various layers, think about the system as a whole. And so forcing you to think about the abstraction we call the dominant S plus got you to tick those two boxes. Because if your S pluses aren't consistent with each other, something in your analysis is incorrect. And rather than you perpetuate that inaccuracy and then do the wrong thing, we just constantly force you to take notes on the dominant S plus, again, because it does those two clinical things. Recently, as we've laid out PBBT as a whole program, as we get ready to launch the PBT Institute, our clinicians were really struggling with trying to find the dominant early on, but you don't need to. You need to keep an eye on it, but it's only when you get down into the system and when you're working in the sort of, essence layer, and then you're going to transition over to self-other. It's only when you're really familiar with the system that you've got to then identify the dominant S plus and make sure that your dialogue allows you to recognize and weaken it, so this is all about control, or so you don't go in at the beginning like you would in ACT, sort of talking about control is the problem. You sort of join all these dots, and then all your ducks are lined up and they are all consistent with each other. Then you understand the system as a whole. So rather than sending you in to look for the dominant too early or formulate it, we just put in these parts in the system that says, if you saw A, B, and C, and D as S pluses, what might that say your S pluses? And before you're finished therapy, before you're transitioning over to self-other, you need to make sure that you've identified your S plus, and you need to weaken it, because ultimately the system is playing a game of regulation, control, or whatever it is. So you need to keep an eye out for it, check your consistency, and then you don't normally need to give it a label to the end, and you're only doing that to make sure it's absolutely weakened, because you won't weaken that system until you've weakened the way the system predominantly works. So it was much a sort of clinical pragmatic thing in the creation of that concept, as it being a thing itself. It was more about clinical pragmatics.
Mm. And so the dominant it's almost like a category label for these sort of the behaviors you're seeing most, or the ones that are the most I don't know, most powerful or most
Yeah.
sort of in your face, like, yeah, control or seeking approval or regulating.
Like an
Yeah,
overarching function. Think about it like an overarching function.
yeah. Like,
Bit like that.
what are they all there to do? They're there to
Exactly.
control, they're there to regulate, they're there to
Exactly.
get
Exactly.
approval. Yeah, that
Yeah,
makes a
they're
lot of
all
sense.
grapes in the same bunch, and it's just about seeing that consistency.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you wouldn't, so say when you're working at that proxy level, are you sort of touching the dominant S pluses in the proxy relationship, or only
I
if
think
they're getting
anytime
in the
you
way,
touch an
or
S plus, you're touching a dominant.
yeah.
I think in every S plus, I think just serves that dominant functionality in the system. So it's only when you start to weaken the S pluses, you start to think this bloody whole thing's control, or this is all regulating, or whatever. So I think anytime you touch a finger, you touch the hand. I think it's a bit like that, but your job is to try not to take the dominant down or really accurately label it until you're well inside the system and you know what the sort of beast is you're dealing with. Because then when you do weaken it, you'll be in a position to really know how that system works. So I think every S plus is an echo of the dominant. So
Mm. And there's a, like you said, there's an internal coherence in the verbal system. It's not like it's going to be control at the top layer and then at the bottom layer it's
no
something
chance.
else.
Never seen that. And we've some very complex and very, very unsettled, and one might say very distressed and very disturbed clients. And I've never over 25 years of clients and supervision, I've never seen a system that was inconsistent. Why would it do that? Wouldn't a
Uh,
system wouldn't survive like that?
yeah. As you were talking about emotions as S pluses, it reminded me of, I just read Linda Hayes and Mitch Freiling's book on interbehaviorism
Well
recently.
done for
And
getting through it.
I love that book. Oh, yeah, people should read that. And I like, they use, I think it's from Cantor, but they use this description of emotions as affective actions with an A, and then
Exactly.
as things we do as effective actions with an E.
Yeah,
And I like it when you say that, I'm like, yeah, the verbal system is emoting, or the verbal system
exactly.
is
Activating.
making me pick something up, or
Exactly.
it's all an activation. And I like that because it's we can get so lost as clinicians pulling apart all the S pluses and saying, oh, is that fusion? Is that avoidance? Do they out of the present moment? Like, what is it? And it just seems like putting it all in one bucket and saying, it seems like everything they're doing is regulating, but also then just clocking that. And then when you've got a view of the whole system, checking, okay, is this
Yeah,
right? And not jumping in up
exactly.
front. Yeah.
Exactly. It's so important to remember too, and this is very important to PBBT, and it's not important to other therapies, but in behavioral thinking, there are only S pluses and S minuses. There's nothing in between, you know. You can't just go making things up. Emotions have to be categorized as an S plus or an S minus. They're not a separate category.
Mhm.
So something is active in the system somewhere. It doesn't give you emotions for nothing, because emotions are painful and intense and difficult and confusing. So if they're not an S minus, they simply had to be an S plus. So there weren't
Mhm.
many options for us to go on, and we weren't making up a new term in behavior analysis. So the catch-all was naturally sitting there in behavior analysis for us. And
Mhm.
it was the catch-all wasn't an S minus.
Mhm.
And sort of actively, the catch-all was the S plus.
So we've touched on relating is like the kingpin at the top. Evoking's the E in the row, and we've got, I kind of picture it with an S plus going one way and the S. I was thinking of S minus as like withdrawal behaviors, but what you're saying makes a lot more sense, that like everything's like a towards move. If people use that terminology, it's like everything's going towards safety.
Yeah. Or
Then,
stopping danger is also an S plus.
yeah, so then we've got the O left, the orienting function. In some ways that's probably self-explanatory to people, but like how do you kind of conceptualize and use that in PBBT? Because I heard you kind of telling us clinicians to stop digging for the specific, triggers and all this kind of stuff because the world's just too complex and the verbal system's too complex.
Okay, so the O, it was new in the row in the sense that orienting became its own function. It was categorized as a function and it was separated from evoking because the data suggested they are two separate but interrelated things. So it was just conceptual necessity. And orienting is just like recognition of a stimulus, that's all. It's just you're orienting to something, but you don't have to be aware of it. You're usually not. And orienting just basically gives license for evoking to happen. It just opens the gate and evoking just happens pretty much automatically. It was sort of simultaneous. Okay. And for RFT and for PBBT, everything is verbally acquired. So you won't know the cues. How would you know? You didn't know when it was learned. You don't know how long it's been there. You don't know how it evolved. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to go looking for the cues. Well, partly just because you never find them. And if you did, how do you know they were correct? The other thing that we're very cautious of in PBBT relative to other regimes that are very awareness focused, and I frankly think awareness is overrated. I always have done, but it has its place, but when it's not the be all and end all, is that you don't really have a lot of control when a stimulus is oriented to over and over and over again. In my experience clinically, you won't reduce the orienting. You can just break up the relationship between orienting and evoking. But I've broken relationships between orienting and evoking many times and reduced the evoking to nothing. And they're still orienting really heavily. Germs still scare them. Intimacy still spooks them. They'll do it or they'll not do it, but I can break that chain between orienting and evoking. But clinically, I just never really managed to wash down orienting. And I haven't seen we haven't got great data right now, an updated RFT on orienting for me to formulate any sort of decent sense of, well, how would you wash it down? Because the answer is I don't really know. I just know that you can't do it very often. And I'm not really convinced of awareness training regimes that say they can change orienting. I just haven't really seen very impressive data on that. So, when updated RFT has done more work on orienting and it says, okay, you can wash down orienting, you can reduce it, and that in turn helps reduce evoking, then that would be great. And then, okay, then show me how you did it in an experiment and I'll see if I can model that in PBBT. So it's not that it's not important. It's just, I just don't think we've got those answers. I don't think we've got empirical data right now that show us that you can weaken orienting, that it has the effect that you want on weakening evoking, and that those empirical studies give me some sort of ability to then work out a clinical way to do that. I just don't believe that updated RFT's data is there yet. So I've sort of recently talked to RFT folks and said, look, if you want to do experiments that are connected to PBT, could you look at orienting for me? And could you see, can you weaken orienting? What impact does it have on evoking? And see where the data goes in that. And if the data shows that you can, then I'll start looking at sort of maybe clinically modeling that and putting it into PBBT. But I don't have grounds for doing that right now. So my job is to sort of get PBBT on the ground, up and running, focus on evoking. And when the data comes in, of course, we'll adjust as we go along. So I hope the RFT guys can show us way to wash down orienting. But frankly, right now, I just don't see any clear evidence that that's the case. It would be great if there was. It'd be an extra string to our bow along with changing, relating, and evoking. But I see no reason right now to put it lock, stock, and barrel in the middle of PBBT because I've just got no reason to do that. So it's, in my opinion, it's just not there yet.
Mm. Yeah, and it kind of it sort of makes sense that, you know, for relatings, like running the show, it's kind of your orienting's driven
Oh
by
yeah,
what's important to orient to, which is related to what meaning things you experience in the world have. So yeah, even if you could just chop out the orienting and it changed the evoking, it's like if that problematic relation is sitting underneath, you just kind of, it seems like you're just blunting things and then
exactly. And you're going to orient to what you're going to orient to, aren't you? It's not the orienting that's doing you the damage in a way. It's part of it, but it's the relating and the evoking that are making the stimulus jump out. They're making the thing meaningful in the first place. So the orienting becomes less of an issue clinically, becomes, much less of an issue if you weakened relating. Why? Because they just don't care about the thing anymore. They see it a lot, they're a bit focused on, but it doesn't have the same power.
mm,
So they can still be orienting at the same level, but it doesn't have the same power in a meaning or evoked sense.
yeah.
So PBBT doesn't need it right now, need to focus on orienting, but if the data says it'll help, we'll sure look at that.
I'm sure you will follow the data. I have full
Well,
confidence in that. Um, Within those rows, so we got these kind of chunky rows at the manifest, the character, the essence level.
yeah.
And then within the HTML framework, there's also these, I can always remember three and then I always forget one, but like coherence, flexibility, I only remember two,
Derivation and complexity.
derivation and
You're gonna
complexity.
forget anything, forget flexibility because it really doesn't matter. I
Yeah.
like
I don't always
forget
remember the
that.
same three, but I always can remember three and then I'm like, what?
Like in truth, really, in PBBT going forward, in truth, we're really only going to focus on two. We're going to focus on complexity and coherence.
All right, well
They've got they get the most influence. Derivation has already happened. There's nothing you can do with that anyway. Just don't make it worse. And flexibility is more of an experimental thing. So you just need to remember two, and that's coherence and complexity. Don't worry about the others.
well, let's talk through those. So yeah, what's meant by coherence and complexity, and um, I'll let's grab derivation as well because I want to ask you something about that. Um, and yeah, what does that mean at those different row levels?
So if I think about a character there, piece of self-relating or self-meaning of I am bad, and it's a really common one. And it's sort of front-ended with I'm afraid and sort of back-ended with I'm nobody or I'm nothing, right? So it has amassed this incredible detail, hasn't it? That all the reasons why you're bad, all the reasons why you are nothing, and all the reasons why you're anxious. So it's really clunky. You're right, really chunky and clunky, and it has got, you've got your reasons for being bad, and those reasons are based on details and events and things you said and she said and whatever. Okay. So complexity is just the amount of stimuli in the network, just the density of the network, the amount of details picked up. Thousands and thousands of stimuli participate in that network. You can think of them, she's better than me, I'm better than her, but whatever. I mean, in so many ways to be good, bad, and whatever. So complexity just is literally just like the density or weight of the network. It's the amount of sort of reasons and bits and pieces and detail in there. So in PBBT, as PBBT's been laid down and we've worked with the wording, we just call that detail. It's just detail, the detail attached to being bad. And of course it's high. You don't need to measure it clinically. You need to measure it in an experiment, but you need to measure it clinically to know it's high. But you want to check it's high because the details are part of how the whole thing hangs together. The detail is part of what keeps I'm bad, I'm bad, I'm bad activated, if you know what I mean, and all the functionality going. And the details as well serve, I think, to keep the client going on that track. I need to make sure I don't do that because then I'll be bad. So they maintain the system as in a day by day, moment by moment basis. So complexity is just detail, and coherence is just, we just started calling coherence truth or truth value, because it's the extent to which it feels true for the client, not truth value externally. Truth value as in it's what clients know, one, then two, then three. It says just that's the way it is. You don't put two after three. That's just the way it is. And I think I like the word truth if you don't say it in an ontological way, because clients do see it as true. It is true for clients, whether you believe that or not. So in PBBT going forward, we've talked about coherence as truth, and we've talked about complexity as detail. Because if you look at what clients do in session, they just convince you about truth and they just give you detail. So for clients, it's just truth and detail. So we started using those less technical terms to get clinicians to work with coherence and complexity. And typically, you're going to, well, not typically, pretty much everybody, coherence is high and complexity is high. There are exceptions, as you perhaps know, where complexity is low, but that doesn't mean it's not strong either. It just means complexity was high and then it dipped low. But truth and detail, coherence and complexity just give clients reason to believe what they already believe. So they really, really matter to clients. And what we do in PBBT typically when we're weakening the system is we're going to weaken and reduce coherence, and we're going to weaken and reduce complexity, because they are dynamically just two cogs that keep that wheel turning. We don't hit them straight on by arguing that's not true. We have more subtle ways of doing it, but either way, they have to go from high to low.
Mm. And well, yeah, what are some of the ways that you would kind of do that in the clinical work?
A really simple example and a really powerful example of reducing complexity is if you use a metaphor. Like, you know, we all have a metaphor we use in PBBT a lot. We use it more in training than with clients, but it's like, you know, putting 100 ants in a bag. Imagine that if you were very anxious and I listed the last 100 things you worried about, the last 100 anxious thoughts you had. And if they were like ants and I went all around the floor and I lifted every single ant and I put them in a bag, it would be one bag with 100 ants. It wouldn't be 100 ants. It'd be one bag with 100 ants. So, and what the metaphor does, it says these aren't 100 things, these are just one thing. And I put a big A in the bag for anxiety. So 100 ants suddenly becomes one bag with just one ant. And you can see and feel that's very different to dealing with one bag rather than dealing with 100 ants. But there's still 100 ants in there. I've not negated the ants in any way. And what it does is it just reduces complexity. It just says there aren't 100 things here. There's just one thing here. So if I say, you know, this is like that metaphor, you know, with the lion tamer and the lion, or the metaphor with the lion and the mouse. Everything is just about a lion and a mouse. It's just about two things. It's not about everything else. And what metaphors do is they distill a big story down into a single small story. And that really reduces complexity. So almost all of the metaphors, and definitely all of the analogies, they reduce complexity by saying all those things that look different, they're all part of the same thing. I'm going to put them all together in this story about Cinderella or whatever metaphor we're using at the time. And so it just sort of sucks down the detail down into, without negating the detail, because it's in a story context, it validates the detail. Says that, you know, there are 100 ants here, but it manages to suck down the detail from like 100 to 1. And that is an incredibly powerful move, partly because it doesn't negate detail. It acknowledges detail, but it sucks the heat of it into one thing as opposed to 100 things or whatever. And you pull complexity away from the relating, almost without the relating realizing you're doing it, because you haven't negated, you haven't invalidated the system in any way. So one of the most foolproof ways to do that, to reduce complexity, is have a metaphor that, and most metaphors do this, they take multiple things and they suck them down. Or if you say to a client, you know, I've listened to everything you said, and I just think, gosh, anxiety's a monster. He's a monster. So rather than thinking and feeling and worrying, it's just he is a monster. So I've taken 1,000 bits and I've turned them into a single monster. And then the dialogue is easier, it's manageable, whatever. See, I mean, that's why in PBBT and in RFT, we make such a big deal out of analogy and metaphor because it's such an important clinical tool and it's especially important in reducing complexity.
On that, one thing I noted, and you can tell me if this is out of date, was the use of analogy and metaphor differently and in different places. And I wonder, is that still kind of part of your thinking with PBBT? And can you talk through kind of the jobs those two things have?
It is, yeah. I mean, you know, these data are very old in RFT. These are sort of Ian Stewart's PhD data and onwards. So I mean, it's a good 20 odd years, but you know, that data for me still stands. It's the best data on metaphor and analogy in RFT that I think we have or are ever going to have. And it's better than analogy metaphor data in any other field, frankly, I've ever seen. So it still really stands the test of time. And it basically says, use analogy for relating and use metaphors for functions. Because, you know, a metaphor is designed to essentially to get you to stop doing something. And an analogy is designed to tell you a story, to say something's a bit like this. So when you see it a bit like this, then stop doing it. But we typically go analogy, then metaphor. You introduce your story analogically, and then use your story to do whatever you want metaphorically. And that means that your metaphors do exactly what you want them to do, and you stop trying to make analogies do things analogies can't do. And that basically, that core distinction, analogies for relating and metaphors for functions, that goes back to Ian Stewart's PhD. And there's no reason for us not to keep going that way because that data was just so robust.
And that just makes sense in a human sense as well, that like analogies kind of give you an understanding of things that you didn't have before. It's like, this is like this. And as you say, put the ants in a bag. And then metaphors kind of give you almost an instruction of, well, if that, you know, if this is a bag of ants, like what do we want to keep? Do we want to spread them out and chase them around all session, or, you know?
Exactly. You don't do it, you don't change the function in a finger wagging way. And you don't drop in a metaphor that tries to change the function when you haven't told a story.
Yeah.
So get your story landed first. Make sure it's landed. Make sure they've derived this new way of thinking. Oh yeah, I never thought of ants in a bag before, whatever. Never thought of myself as holding the sack. I never thought of my anxious thoughts as ants or whatever. Get your story landed. And only when it's landed, when they've derived what you need them to derive, only then tackle your function. So it allows you to not do clumsy. That's one thing I did see in ACT a lot. People were really clumsy with metaphors. ACT had generated some beautiful metaphors and people were awfully clumsy with them. And that's partly because they didn't really understand the distinction between opening up the story with an analogy to tackle the relating and create a new piece of relating. And then based on the new piece of relating, change the function after that. And in PBBT, we tried to really ensure that doesn't happen.
And I think that slow burn of getting to know the system before you start poking at it is really different to C fusion, do D fusion, or C control, pull out the metaphor I learned in my training. It's which I'm not criticizing that because I've done it myself a lot.
I've done that too. If you're clumsy, the system will just spit in your face. It just, you know, functions are so hard to change. They won't change by direct instruction. They're far too clever. The system's too clever for that. You've got to really be stealthy with it. Got to catch it unawares, and a really good metaphor does that.
Because in a sense, the verbal system comes into therapy if they're coming in voluntarily saying, I don't like these particular evoked functions. Can you help me dampen them down or get rid of them? And as you're saying that, it's like if we directly challenge that system, it's, you know, it's protecting something. It's gonna like, we're not gonna get it that way. But your analogy to me, it's like adding a different meaning beside the additional meaning, and then sort of letting those, that adding complexity of kind of letting them fuse, not fuse, but letting them wash together. And
Exactly. Letting the new relation do its work. The old relation will do what the old relation is meant to do. It has an old function. In the story, you created a new relation. You know, my anxiety is like an ant. I'm like the bag keeper. I mean, those new relations will do new things. Old relations will do old things. So you've got to switch the relating. You're not switching the perspective. You're just changing, you're just creating a new piece of relating. A new piece of relating has the chance to do new things. An old piece of relating has no chance to do new things.
is there a difference? I'm kind of picking up a difference in that. A, we probably don't know our target, or we don't really know what we're trying to do when we step into therapy, because we don't know the system yet. And what we're wanting to do is find the relations that aren't working for the client, and help them to open up or shift, or, but we're not kind of, I think in some therapies we're kind of prescribing like, well, after we do our work, then they'll be, say, psychologically flexible, and that looks like this. Whereas I'm hearing like, we don't know, we just know if we help them shift those relations, open them up, we don't know what they'll do with that, or where that will lead.
Yeah.
Is that
I'm really glad you asked that, because we don't get to talk about this much in PBBT because we're always deconstructing the house. We never really get a chance to talk about the new house. And it's partly just because it takes so long and lots of clients don't get there. But deconstruction is a great job. I'm not underestimating that. But so one thing we've really been really careful about in the layout of the structure of PBBT is not to specify what the new house looks like, because then it's too white, it's too colonial, it's too, everybody needs to be healthy, everybody needs to be aware, everybody needs to be grounded. It's just too dictated and prescribed, and that's for me the problem in the first place. And it's very much unspecified in PBT. It's very much, there has to be a better life than this. Let's get this one out of the way and let's go sniffing about that one. And it's really is a sniff, it's a nudge. It's really, really, I mean, and I was really influenced by a PhD myself, my husband supervised many years ago by a great student of ours, Agata Vitale. And she did her PhD on transitive inference of all things. Sounds very cognitive. But I really learned from that PhD the power of the unspecified relation. Leave a relation open and weaken the relating and the functions that are already there. And by the time you're in the essence layer and you're talking about, okay, what about the little girl behind the curtain who, you know, who loved being out looking at night, out at night, looking at nighttime, looking at how things were quiet. Where is she? And we do a lot of childhood work at that layer. And we're digging back to, you know, was there a she before the trouble started? Or, you know, what did she love to do? As she was, you know, lots of clients who'll say, oh, you know, I say for homework, I want you to go off and I want you to talk to the girl in the yellow coat, the one who loved to play in the garden. And so with whatever foundations in the system that are solid, that are good, we create a context for going back and then bringing that forward again. And if it's not there, it's not there, but it's already in the system or it remains unspecified. It's not my responsibility. And I frankly have no right to dictate the terms of a new system. How would I know what they really and truly want or what they're capable of? They don't even know that themselves. So the new house is really, our job is just to go, I think that'd be great ground for a new house. Why don't you go build one? And we just give them the confidence and the support and the space and the ownership to do that as we deconstruct the old one. And but it's just, it's too controlling, it's too intrusive. You've just got no right to, you know, steal someone else's thunder. Just let them build their own house. Just give them the confidence to do it. So there's that non-prescriptive thing that is really important to me and Kira in the building of the new house. And if you step back from that specification and you leave that open and you connect the dots to what mattered to them before, the house will build itself.
Well, the old house built itself based on what it was taught.
Exactly.
So they know how to build a house. We all do.
House
We all do. Yeah.
It's just about freedom. We always use that word freedom in PBBT. Ultimately, I think what we're going for in PBBT is freedom from history and freedom to be your own person. Dismantle one, let the other one go itself.
Yeah. I love that. Freedom from history and freedom. What was the second bit? Freedom to be your own person.
Yeah, to be your own person. And whether people like it or not, who cares? You don't have to like it.
Yeah. So there's something I was really curious about that kind of fits with that. So I work a lot with people who have experienced coercive control and family and domestic violence, and have just lived under dictatorships with other people in different contexts. And I noticed that, like, understandably, their sense of self has become completely has come to completely revolve around the other person's mood and behaviors and all of those things for safety reasons. So I'm just curious. I heard you talking about people with unusual experiences where the self-other layer has you talked about that kind of really fluid boundary between self and other.
Yeah.
And I see that a bit with survivors of violence as well in those contexts. Yeah, when there's that self-other dominance, and that's really, is it a kind of different piece of work than the straight self-relating, or what?
That's a good question. There are two pieces to this I just want to flag up. One is what we call self-other dominance, where the self-other row is dominating. It's got the most functionality. And that connects to the other bit we use this metaphor like the skin boundary. That basically says that if you are in a coercive environment for any period of time where the coercion comes to dictate things like what you feel, like I'll tell you when to cry. No, that wasn't cruel. I was doing this for your own good, stuff like that. In that sense, those experiences, when you're vulnerable, they cross the skin boundary because someone externally is telling you what you feel internally. And I can't remember the year, but it was connected to Keira McIntyre's PhD, and we published a paper, I think it was on dissociation, a good few years ago. It was the Journal of Dissociative Disorders, I think it was. And we laid out the sort of RFT model in a way of what happens when that skin boundary doesn't form or is broken, and your internal states are tacted and then dictated by an external source. And that break for us in the skin boundary in our clinical experience is enormously damaging because you don't own your own thoughts. You have to check what they mean through somebody else. So your sense of autonomy is just gone. Like if you think about the fun children have in lying, it's because they know you can't know. And that the whole development of deception around 8, 9, that's really important because you realize they don't have control of what's in here. But if you're as a young person or even as an older person, and that internal control, so what we sort of say, the locus of control that's internal becomes a locus of control that's external, and that sort of skin boundary is broken, then it leads to self-other rows dominating, and it leads to this massive attrition in any chance that the self-relating is going to have functions that are protective or empowering or whatever. So whenever that skin boundary is broken by one type of coercive control or another, the impact on the human being is just massive. It's a massively traumatic set of experiences because you're no longer a human being. You're just a thing that's dictated by something externally. So it's an incredibly destabilizing place to be. So when self-other dominates, we don't say, oh, that's just another way. It's a really serious other way. It's a really, really, really problematic other way. And in PBBT, we have to navigate that journey really carefully, because if you don't do that, the self-relating underneath that, you won't get to it. You won't be able to do the self-relating work, because it's like when you work with children, they live in their parents' house. You can't talk about freedom because they haven't got freedom, so that's just context. So in context where control by an external source is coercive, it's not a simple case if you just do the self-relating as you always would, because you won't be able to. The self-other dominates, so we have to weaken the self-other perspective. That's why the proxy work is so important. We have to weaken that self-other first before we get access to the self-relating. So it changes the trajectory. The moves are the same, but the trajectory is rotated or changed because of the dominance of self-other. But dominance of self-other is a very, very dangerous place for a human being to be.
I think the violation of skin boundary, I think that's a really nice way to describe that experience, because I think what people often walk out of those places with is looking at specific behaviors and trying to figure out, well, was that bad, or how bad was it? And society reinforces that of like, well, did you get hit? Did you get threatened? Did this, this, that, the other? And it's like, what I see is really coercive, high-level perpetrators can violate that skin boundary without ever, with a raise of their eyebrow.
Exactly.
Once they've trained people to know what to expect, or not know what to expect.
That's why I
And
think victims can't leave. I mean, victims get frustrated but if the skin boundary is broken, how can you leave? I mean, they're your other half. They're, in that sense, they're under your skin. So you'd be leaving a part of you. And I think that's why it's so hard. It's why I understand people who don't present with the capacity to leave, even though it's highly aversive. I can really understand that in terms of the skin boundary metaphor.
And I think when those people come into therapeutic places and they get just a self-relating focus, and maybe from another something that's not as precise as PBBT as well, it can almost say like, all right, your anxiety is the problem. Let's work through your anxiety, rather than going, how do we get you like freedom from your history and freedom to be your own person again?
Exactly, because you're defined by another. I see that you're defined by another. I see that this is how it works. And let's talk about, before we talk about who you are defined as, let's talk about the fact that you're also predominantly defined by another, or this particular person. So I just think you just miss their lived experience of the skin boundary, and you miss the fact that a part of who they are is located in somebody else. It's just the nature of their experience, and that has to be dealt with before you can start talking about who they are.
Yeah. Perfect explanation. I want to ask just probably one more area. So you talked about these kind of layers, and them as developmental layers. So I work with children and young people quite a bit, and I see the concepts as really transferable, and I have noticed talking to them, there's still a lot more kind of that system's a lot more flexible still. There's a lot more
Yeah.
room to
softer.
move in it.
Yeah.
Have you kind of explored PBBT work with children and young people? And is it kind of a different piece of work just because of the I mean, just in terms of how many layers there are? That's
We're
probably
not, so first of all, we're not going to go down the Act for Cats route. We're not going to go down for
good.
the PBBT. We're not, because I think what is really unique about PBBT, whether people are ambitious or not enough to believe this, is that PBBT is one size fits all. And I'm so glad to be confident in that now, as we've sort of post the CBT for everything, a bit of everything thing. I think I'm feeling we're really past that now. I mean, you know, and it's ambitious to think that there is a one size fits all, but I believe that there is, and I believe it's PBBT. I think it's possible at least. So again, it's like the thing we talked about before, the course of control. It's more of a question of how you come at the system and how you manage it. Okay, it's not going to be fundamentally different. I mean, we deal with all sorts of clients, all sorts of ages, whatever. And we've never had to deviate off the plan massively, but it's idiosyncratic. So, and it's, you know, so you have to go to move where the system allows you to go, like pacing and timing really varies massively with clients. Okay, so within the constraints of the sort of, or within the sort of broad brush, the one size fits all thing, if you're dealing with a young person, you're not dealing with a very sophisticated top layer, because you're probably dealing with a strong echo of the essence layer. It's still pretty close. And you're dealing with the formation of that sort of middle character layer. They're just forming, this is my character, an identification with the sort of negative evaluation of character. You will see the beginnings of that manifest layer, because they will be getting, you know, anxious. Usually they'll be saying, I'm stressed, or I'm depressed or anxious or whatever, but they usually mean they're stressed. Someone's bothering them. That's what they really mean. They don't really know what it is, but it's bothering them. It makes them upset or sad. So you're seeing the formation of that top layer. You're seeing that manifest layer just sort of start to emerge. But really, and I'm not underplaying teenage emotions at all, but really, they're struggling with a negative evaluation of their character. Oh shit, this is who I am. And that's a strong echo of the layer closely below it, that I am this, and this is my way of coping with being that, with being worthless or invisible or whatever. So you're seeing a not really thick middle layer, it's thick enough, and you're just seeing the sort of hints of a top layer forming. Now, we see teenagers and young people, we see young people with no top layer. They've not really manifest. I'm not saying they're not experiencing emotion, but their identity is not manifested through a key emotional experience. But they're still having a tough time. But they're wrestling with a formation of a negative evaluation of character. And that just hurts. That's just difficult for them. It's very confusing. They don't really know it's who they want to be. It's not who they want to be, it's who they must be, etc. So wherever your young person is, your job is to work out, have we got 3 layers? How thick is the second layer? And how close is that lowest layer to that middle layer? You know, can we talk about visibility? Does it make sense to connect not being enough to visibility? Does it make sense to do it now? Does it make sense to do it later? And of course, all of this is in the constraints of you're not playing for freedom, because they don't have freedom. You're playing for a healthier identity. You're playing to minimize the unhealthy identity, if you know what I mean, that they've already acquired. But one thing to really register when you're working with young people, even quite young, that essence layer is already formed. That it's in there. It's in there from really an early verbal age. Your identity acquires this meaning. For example, you know, you're only a good boy when you get good grades. You're only a good girl when you do what your mommy says or whatever. That is just normal, healthy training, but it skews us towards my identity. I only matter when I do good things. I'm exaggerating a little, but you know what I mean. So you're already dealing with a thick essence layer. And so there's no question about that. Everybody's got a thick essence layer. And your job is then to work on what's the formation of the layers on top. So the essence layer is a given. The dilemma is, what have we got on the top? And how can I create a dialogue that ties these pieces together? Because you can't dialogue with a 12-year-old the way you dialogue with a 25-year-old.
Mm.
So you've got to really think very creatively about how you create and navigate that dialogue, which you don't have to do as much with the older ones. So it's a lighter layer load, but it's a much more creative dialogue.
Mm.
And you're not playing for freedom, which constrains you massively.
So is that is that a kind of way to conceptualize the work? Is that we're trying to get an understanding of all the layers and how they kind of fit together. And then when we're confident, we're feeling pretty confident that we understand it, then we're trying to have a dialogue with the client that kind of ties all that together. And then,
But in a layer by layer way, you
okay,
don't, yeah, you
not
have to do it layer
like,
by layer
yeah,
because you only know what you know when you start digging.
yeah.
That's why we get you to begin to formulate that manifest layer when you're in that territory and
So
keep an eye out for
so
the
you're
lower
working
layer.
on that. Are you working on that layer? Like you find the manifest layer and then you're doing work on it and then you're kind of checking what's underneath and
Exactly. You're digging layer by layer. And as you're digging layer by layer, of course, you're thinking about the dominant S plus and you're thinking, how does this work? Like, what's the system about? What would that essence layer be? But pragmatically, you're working layer by layer. Otherwise, the verbal system, it will tell you where to go. Verbal systems have a tendency to pull you to the middle layer to get you to stay off the top layer and to get you to get your hands off the bottom layer and just keep you swirling around. Like some systems will keep you swirling around anxiety at the top layer. And then, but a lot of systems will keep you swirling around, say, I am bad, aren't I? Say, I am broken. And if you don't do your work in a layer by layer way, and you have a set amount of work to do until the layer weakens and you get that sort of green light that organically transitions you to the next layer, the layers are just going to play you. The system will play you. So you can't let the system dictate the terms like that. So you've got to do a certain amount of work at each layer, and then that's an information gathering exercise.
and is that just like a felt sense of we can move to the next layer, or are there things that you're looking
Green
for?
light. Yeah, you realize the S pluses are weakening. The client goes, yeah, you're right. Anxiety is a waste of my time. The client gives you evidence, and we do what's called consistency checking. The client gives you evidence that you use make statements that you use as evidence, and they do things, and you use that as evidence to show that they're relating at that layer is weakening. The S pluses are weakening, and you feel it, and you see it, and you just. And then if you think, okay, I can really feel that the S plus is weakening, but there's still coherence here. So I haven't got the green light just yet so we sort of think about it as a sort of green light thing. And in laying out PBBT as a program, we've put the transition phases as actual phases, is to get you to make sure you don't green light until you got the green light. So don't go too quickly, because that's all therapists go too quickly. They love the precision. They get excited by the middle layer. And partly that's just the middle layer calling your name because it's going to keep you there. So it just stops you losing control and just create a certain set of things for you to orient to say, is this done? Is this done? Is this done? And what does this really feel like? What am I feeling in the room now? And you're going to use all those as cues to transition.
Perfect.
So you can pace yourself well.
One last question, and then probably let you do something before you got to go to bed. Probably do some more work, I'm guessing.
No, nothing more than 10 o'clock this morning. I'm on about 12 hours now.
Okay. Okay, I won't keep you much longer. I heard you talk about people who see other people as stimuli or objects, not as people. I see that. I do a little bit of work with young people on the spectrum. I don't think it's the case for everyone on the spectrum, but that some people have this way of seeing other people. And I'm curious about it with some coercive control perpetrators that I work with, whether it is just a functional thing or whether it's how they actually see people. But I was really interested in hearing you talk about if someone sees people as objects, how we need to really rethink what we're doing and whether we should be doing anything. And yeah, I wonder if you could just talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, this is, it's a simple idea really that we sort of bumped up against a couple of years ago. And again, I'm sort of sensitive to it because I don't want this to sound like I think people are doing something wrong. I think people come in different shapes and sizes. And I think in my clinical experience, and I've done a lot of work over the years on autism and Asperger's and people on that spectrum or whatever you want to call it. And I have come to see that some people, and they're often on what might be called that spectrum, they don't have to be, you're right, not everybody is, and they see other people as objects and not people. And I'm not saying they treat them badly, or that I'm not saying anything like that. I'm just simply saying that that stimulus has different functions. People have different, as a stimulus, has different functions for that person than if it was me or you or somebody else or whatever. Okay. And in my experience, that doesn't change. It doesn't change. I've never been able to change it. And it doesn't matter to me what explanation you give it, right? It's problematic for the person and it's problematic for the people around them because we live in a world where there's just a rule that says you have to see people for people. You can't see people as something else. Like the rule is, you can't love your pets more than people. It's the same sort of thing, right? I'm just giving you a simple analogy. So it's the only explanation I could come up with. And it's not that sophisticated that their stimuli have different functions. But it allowed me to stop trying to change something I couldn't change. And it allowed me to create a focus on what we could change. Otherwise, you get a client who's trying to be somebody they're not, and they never will be. And that, I think we've no ethical justification for that. And just because I see people as people doesn't mean you have to either. So we started to just come up with that explanation about, is this a client who fundamentally sees other people as stimuli? And is it likely to change? And if it isn't likely to change, then at a higher level, you have to rethink the way you approach it. Because a lot of what we do in the self-relating and a lot of what we do in the self-other relating, of course, is built on the idea that the client will see people as people. But if they don't, and they won't, then you need to come at it in a slightly different way. So a lot of what we do, again, is the same. But when it comes to other people, we have to think differently. And giving people space to have a dialogue and to build a life where they don't have to change the way they see other people is enormously liberating for those people, because they've been around that block a lot. They know they see people differently and they get shamed for it, and it creates conflict. And sometimes just opening up, just liberating the dialogue. We don't say that, oh, you just see people as stimuli. We never say that, but creating a different outcome, moving in a slightly different way, and taking that relationship self-other, you have to see, taking that thing out of it and giving them, like, sometimes it's just rules about, when they say this, you say that. Like sometimes we just do a lot of scripting because they just won't be able to work it out for themselves. And they just get humiliated and frustrated by trying. So I think it's a really fundamental piece. It's very simple. I'm not claiming it's sophisticated in any way, but the best explanation I could come up with was seeing people as stimuli as a different type of stimuli, not as the way lots of other people see it. And that has given us enormous freedom to work with those clients and not to try to change behavior that can't change. If you can't change, if behavior can't change, you have no ethical permission to try to change it. You've got to focus on building a life around it and changing the things that you can. So we're very guided by our ethical commitments on that too. I mean, if it can't change, you have to let it go. And you have to allow that person to live in a world as happily as anybody else. And I can understand the step that you might be making, say, okay, well, maybe that makes them perpetrate against, maybe it does, but then we have to deal with that. So
Yeah.
it's just, I just think people come and they're not massively different, but in that people to people thing, I think that's one area. People come in different shapes and sizes, and we have to have therapeutic regimes, I think, that recognize and respect, whether we like it or not, that not all stimuli will have the same functions.
Yeah, and I'm not making, because sometimes people will say, like autism causes violence or something, and there's nothing in there. But I just see when I hear people talking about abusive partners and things like that, I hear that there's this echo of you're just another object in the house, and when you don't behave as you should, then they have a system of rules that they implement to get you to do what they want, just like the coffee machine or the car or something else. And I think, yeah, in one sense that's interesting, because a lot of there's no real perpetrator interventions that work well that I've seen. And survivors spend a lot of time either trying to change people or afterwards trying to figure out why was he like this. And sometimes he saw you as just another object in the house, kind of as painful as it is, helps people kind of make sense of that and maybe let go of some of it. Yeah. So yeah, thanks. That's really helpful. Well, I think we covered a lot. That's like nearly 2 hours.
The listeners will be
That's
exhausted.
flown past. If anyone's got this far, well done. But I think I think there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot in there about PBBT that I think people won't have heard before. I'm going to link to the your website and the courses page, because I think the courses there are terrific, and recommend getting into the supervision if anyone's interested in this. I think it's just a really great format that you're putting together.
Keep an eye out for the Institute. We'll be changing now in the next few months as we launch the Institute. So the whole website and everything will change. So I mean, just have a look at it now and just, enjoy the excitement we have at seeing the baby grow and just getting on a life of its own. And it's a lovely community, as you know. It's a community full of the loveliest people. So I mean, I can promise you there's a lovely bunch in there.
Yeah. And I think having something that's faithful to the basic science but is translating that into a human kind of way of doing the work, and evolving as the human side tells us it needs to change, and as the data side tells us it needs to change. It just feels like something new and a really the way of the future, I hope. So Yvonne, thank you so much. It's been really lovely talking to you, and look forward to chatting again soon.
And if anybody has questions or whatever, just email us. The address is on the website. Don't hesitate or be too afraid. Just jump in and email us, and we'll see what we can do.
Yeah, beautiful. All right. Thanks, Yvonne. Appreciate your time. Bye.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.